Okay, greetings, scholars. I am going to start with right off the bat saying you should have already watched the video called Watch Me First. That's why it's first. And from that, we get into the class. This first chapter that we're going to talk about is designed to introduce you to the historical discipline and to introduce you to pre-Columbian civilizations. Pre-Columbian civilizations. What I want to do, what I hope we're going to do, is to dispel at least two myths. The first myth is that Europeans brought civilization to the New World. Now, Europeans did bring a civilization, but it didn't bring civilization as if everything over on this hemisphere was primitive and archaic. The people in this hemisphere already had civilization. They had monumental structures, monumental buildings. They had cities which would have at least 100,000 people. These were civilizations. They were just different civilizations with technological differences. These technological differences we'll get into as we progress through the class. The second myth that we need to dispel is what I like to call the Pocahontas myth. For those of you who've seen the Pocahontas film, Native American civilization did not learn all of its bad habits from Europeans. Prior to the advent of the Europeans, this hemisphere had human sacrifice and cannibalism, and they were people just like the rest of us. And so all the mean, nasty things that people do on the European side of the globe were the same kinds of mean, nasty things that people did. So what we need to do is try to dispel those myths while we try to come to grips with the peoples who lived here originally, where they came from, how they developed, and what was going on prior to what most people say prior to Columbus's arrival. Hence, pre-Columbian civilizations. Now, as we start these videos, I forgot to mention this, so we'll go ahead and mention it again. I'm trying to keep these videos down to between 25 and 30 minutes. Hopefully that will be small enough to where, regardless of what you're having to do, what your day looks like, you will be able to keep up with these videos while you're reading your textbook and taking your quizzes. Now, you must watch the videos. D2L tells me if you've watched the videos. If you watched a 30-minute video for 2 minutes, that is not watching a video. I am putting these things together at enormous effort to make sure I have these produced so you can at least watch them. These videos are supposed to tie things up, supposed to fill in blanks, and supposed to help you as you move forward with the quizzes and reading in your textbook. Now, what we're going to talk about first is archaeology and history. Okay, the distinction between archaeology and history. Archaeology studies the past through artifacts. Both history and archaeology are disciplines which study the past. The archaeologist does so with artifacts. That's his primary focus. The kinds of things we have, the kinds of tools, the kinds of weapons, the kinds of structures, how people buried their ancestors, all the different things that an archaeologist looks for in these civilizations basically are the stuff. What kind of things did they make? The historian, on the other hand, his focus is on documents. I guess documents is a bad term. Well, not a bad term, it just doesn't give us everything. Historians depend on stories. Historians need this notion of context, okay? Most of the civilizations that we're going to look at in this first chapter are what historians refer to as prehistoric. Now, the paleontologist means something completely different when you say prehistoric. The historian means it's a civilization's development prior to the development of writing. Prior to the development of writing. It doesn't mean that they didn't have stories about the past, but in a very technical sense, history is that which is recorded about the past. Now, there are cultures that have had extremely detailed oral histories that have been passed down, and passed down. And fortunately, as these cultures developed, when their writing system came online, those oral traditional stories were written down so that we could still have them even when the civilization fades off the scene. So the archaeologist deals with artifacts. Everything that you might have in your pocket is an artifact. Everything that you carry, every tool you use, these are all artifacts. Okay, documents, any kind of writing, the historian wants to focus on. So basically, I guess a really loose definition of what history is. Okay, I guess a kind of robust definition is that history is stories about the past which are intended to be true. Stories about the past which are intended to be true. I mean, you can tell all kinds of stories and preface it with this statement, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That's talking about the past, but everyone pretty much is sure that that's not intended to be true, okay? So this is the difference between history and archaeology, okay? So what can we know? Archaeology can tell us a lot of things. Archaeologists can tell us where people lived. It can tell us the kind of foods they ate. It can tell us the kind of garments they wore. It can tell us what level of technological sophistication they were at. It can tell us how they buried their dead. It can tell us where they moved to, when they moved. It can, all of these things it can tell us, but what the one thing the archaeologist can't tell us with certainty is why. The why question needs the story. Now you can produce a fairly decent argument for a why based on archaeological evidence, but you can never actually be sure until you have that story. Okay, until you have the story. So as far as the story is concerned, for the historian, this is what gives history, as far as the historian's concerned, some element of certainty. Okay. Now, I'm going to try to truncate this a little bit. Prior to 1912, what did we think about Native American origins? We believed that Native Americans had arrived recently on this continent. We were pretty sure that they were from Asia. Okay, we were pretty sure that there were Asian origins. Okay, we believed around 3,000-4,000 years ago, the Native Americans in the Neolithic period paddled boats across the Bering Straits in search for new lands. Sort of a migration. Bering Straits all the way up here in the map, and they believe that they paddled these little boats, and then from there they went inland. Now, I said that's what we used to believe prior to 1912. In 1912, a man named George McJunkin, who was a ranch manager at the Folsom Ranch, is going to make an archaeological discovery, right? And even though it can't give us why answers, it gives us a big what answer that doesn't line up with anything that they had ever seen before. George McJunkin finds a bone pit filled with the bones of a giant bison. Filled with the bones of a giant bison. Now, George McJunkin found this bone pit in 1912. He told his friend, the blacksmith in the town, about this bone pit because they were both sort of amateur archaeologists. Most of these cowboys were amateur archaeologists because at certain times of the year, you're out there in the middle of the night and all you're doing is watching the cows. You have a tendency to pick up rocks and kick stones around and just sort of wander around, and you find stuff. You find arrowheads and spear points and pottery shards. You find all kinds of stuff. And Carl, the blacksmith in town, would purchase these things from the cowboys. So Carl and George were pretty good friends. So George tells Carl about the bone pit. Well, a couple years later, George dies. And Carl had never gone out to the site. Carl goes out there, finds these bones, and is amazed. They were bigger than George had let on. He takes these bones to a guy named J.D. Figgins, University of Albuquerque. Okay? And when he shows these bones to Figgins, Figgins says, "What are you trying to pull here?" And Carl's like, "Well, I don't know what you're talking about. We found these bones." And the guy says, "These are the bones of a giant bison." And Carl says, "Well, you mean like the buffalo?" He says, "No, giant bison. Those animals have been extinct for over 6,000 years. And Carl said, "Oh, well, how do you think they got there inside this bone pit? Because it wasn't a natural skeleton. All of these bones were shoved in a hole." Well, in between the backbone and two of the ribs, there was a spear point, a tool, meaning that over 6,000 years ago, instead of 3,000 years ago, there were humans in this area. Now, this is important because spear points don't grow on trees. They don't form naturally. So what happened when they brought these bones in, it changed the story. It changed the story radically. And what it has to take into account is something we like to refer to as the Wisconsin glaciation, the Wisconsin Ice Age. Sorry, I have to drink some coffee. We don't need to see that map. We do know, or even back in 1912, we did know most Native American peoples are of Asian origin. The way they did that prior to the discovery of DNA was they did something they referred to as skeletal typing. Okay, they had the European, the Caucasian skeletal type, the African skeletal type, and the Mongolian skeletal type. So we had Asia, Africa, and European skeletal types. Basically the length of bones, the size of jaws, all of these kinds of things go into identifying which group these individuals. Most Native Americans fit into that Asian skeletal type. Once DNA came online, it actually confirmed those suspicions. But again, as science progresses. So we were aware of Asian origins, okay? So we weren't looking at Neolithic Native Americans who had paddled their boats. What we were looking for was Paleolithic Native Americans who follow the herds, the large megafauna, okay? This is an important distinction because these are the ones, these Paleolithic Native Americans are the ones who start making tools. That's where you get the Paleolithic, the old Stone Age, is when Homo sapiens starts making tools. Okay, but during this time period, we know that it's the Wisconsin Glacier. Okay, now this is the thing. Homo sapien, his name means the thinking man. Right? I don't know if if that's as accurate. What I like to think of is when you talk about Homo sapien, you're talking about the adapting man. Okay, Homo sapien adapts. He adapts to his environment, and if he can't adapt to his environment, then he attempts to adapt his environment to himself. Other animals don't do that. Other animals, well, rarely do that with any kind of success. So what we have to understand is the problem is, first, we have to see that humans would be able to adapt to the cold. Well, that's what Homo sapien does. He adapts. Plus, the way that these Native Americans arrived in North America, they had to take advantage of when North America was connected to Asia during this Wisconsin glaciation. I think I've got it here on the map. The map on the right is the Wisconsin Glacier. Okay. The map on the left is what this region called Beringia. Your textbook calls it Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge. Okay. When the glacier's all the way down here to Wisconsin, hence the Wisconsin Glacier, all of the water out of the ocean is on top of Canada. We're talking 100 feet tall block of ice that uses the Hudson Bay as a ramp and comes out of the ocean, causing the sea level to drop, which all of this brown area through here is going to be dry land. As this ice pack starts to melt because of global warming, the planet's getting warmer, so the ice starts to recede, thank goodness. It leaves fresh water. And the herd animals follow the fresh water. Now, who's following the mega herd animals? Homo sapien, Paleolithic man, is following these massive herd animals. This is one of the spear points from this time period. You can see it. It's not napped. It's what's called sanded or polished, a polished stone with a pointy stick. What's going to happen is these guys are going to wind up, as things get warmer, hunting these animals to extinction. Okay, the way they do that is because of how they have to hunt. You can't take this little spear point and put it on the end of a stick and then go up to some giant woolly mammoth and try to bring it down with your pointy stick. You have to do things to immobilize the creature so that it can be captured and destroyed. Okay? Now, as the paleo hunters moved south, following the herds, right, following along where the ice is melting, where the fresh water is, they're going to hunt these. For example, if they have developed the ability to make fire, they might stampede part of a herd of giant tapirs or mastodons or something and try to drive 4 or 5 of them over a cliff. Well, they're not going to eat that much. So what happens, the notion of overhunting, is that they kill 5 or 6 of them just to get the rear haunch of one of the animals. Many believe that it's this overhunting plus the change in the weather patterns. These megafauna are not able to survive as the temperature starts getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Okay, the kind of animals I'm talking about in this area are like these. Now, people have said, "Come on, Mr. Depew, what do you mean those elephants were in Tennessee?" Well, it's not an elephant; it's a mastodon, and we know these animals were in Tennessee. If you are unaware of that, you should take a trip to the Gray Fossil Site, because they just pulled that guy out of the ground. And unless some UFO accidentally dropped him out of his spaceship when it was flying over, he had to get here somewhere. Somewhere or another he got here. So, this is what they're hunting. This is what they're hunting. Now, as these guys start to die off, they're going to have to come up with new sources of food. Okay, new sources of food. The first thing is they're going to have to start focusing on smaller game. In this area, the smaller game compared to those guys would be like the occasional buffalo that's further in West Tennessee, or the elk herds that are numerous in this area. So they will start focusing on smaller game, and with smaller game, they also devote more energy to foraging. It's this extra foraging that's going to cause Homo sapien to develop purposeful agriculture, which leads us into the Neolithic Revolution. Okay, all of this is supposition. It's what we believe happened. Okay, but it's pretty much the best guess. Now, wherever these guys landed, okay, at first they were all following the herds, but when they wind up in these different parts of this continent, right, all these hunter-gatherers, there's no more massive herds for them to follow anymore. Their lifestyle is going to change depending on where they wind up. The Great Plains are going to shift from the giant bison to the regular buffalo, which isn't going to be that much of a change for them. Their lifestyle is not going to change very much. Mesoamerican paleo hunters are going to change the most because of the ability to have successful agriculture. The eastern woodland tribes are going to be semi-nomadic. They are going to farm during the summers and then follow some of the herds, staying close to home during the winter. The Pacific Northwest is going to be different than the other tribal peoples. Looking at their artifacts and their iconography and things like that, their lives are going to change. Their civilizations are going to develop based on the resources they had at hand. Those resources are going to cause their civilizations to develop in the ways that they do. Mesoamerica is going to be some of the most successful of these Native American people groups, simply because the ability to feed so many people in this Neolithic age. Okay, let's see here. Technologies also improve. We go from the spear points to these, which are called napped arrowheads, much smaller. This napping process is going to make these arrowheads much easier to fit to a shaft, make them lighter, plus the edge that they put on it makes the tip, makes the edge of the arrowhead sturdier. Okay, so as they develop, these things are going to be developed to assist them in their food gathering chores. Now, two civilizations that I want to talk about. The only reason I'm going to mention them is because prior to Columbus, both the civilizations we're going to talk about have gone off the scene. They're gone. They weren't destroyed by the Europeans. They were destroyed by themselves. The southwestern cultures and then the Mississippian cultures, the burial mound people. Okay, this one area, Chaco Canyon, here in New Mexico, is the area of the Anasazi, from the Mesa Verde in Colorado, all of this region. You can see all of these little dots on this map. All of those little dots are the small Anasazi villages. Okay, now this is a centralized location. This is this place here, Chaco Canyon. It's a large city complex. These buildings were built 2, 3, 4 stories tall, with light wells to provide light for interior buildings. You can get some glimpse of the size, because that's a big delivery truck, not a pickup truck. That's a big delivery truck there. So that gives you some estimate of the size of this place. Okay, what was it used for? Pretty much storing food, grains. It was a centralized location for commerce, possibly centralized location for religious practices. We know a lot of things that happened. We just don't know a lot of the why answers to why they happened. One of the things about the Anasazi, there's a nice picture of showing the multiple layers in this structure. One of the things that we know happened in this region was cannibalism, at least ritual cannibalism. We're not sure why, but the Anasazi apparently started eating their neighbors. Now, whether it was something that they did because of warrior tradition, if it was something they did because of ancestor tradition, or if they merely in a time of drought decided to use their neighbors as a food source. We're not really sure why, but if that was the case, that's probably what happened to the Anasazi, because their neighbors got tired of being used as a food source. So the Anasazi, before Columbus arrives, are sort of wiped out. Okay, the next group, the Adena and Hopewell, most people refer to them as the mound builders, and the reason is because they build mounds. They build these burial mounds. This isn't where they live. They don't live here. This is sort of the graveyard. Their village is over here. Okay, it's inside these mounds are important members of the tribe. They're buried with food and clothes and with their tools and with the things that they cherished in this life. The question is why, but we don't have a written text. We can speculate a lot as to why, but without a text, you always have to remember it is nothing more than speculation. Okay? Now, this is kind of an archaic mound. Other of these mounds are built in the shapes of different kinds of animals. This is the serpent mound, and this serpent mound in Ohio is it just weaves its way all the way through what's now a national park. Okay, the head of this serpent's mount winds up going towards a river. Whether or not that speaks to some kind of afterlife notion or some kind of way to heaven or something like that, we're really not sure. What we do know is that they did bury a significant number of their tribal members in these mounds. These are two examples of some of the stone shovels that were found in this region. It goes on and on and on and on. Now, again, these mound building peoples are gone by the time Columbus gets here. So these civilizations are coming on the scene and passing on off the scene even before the advent of these Europeans. So we're going to stop there because that's the 27-minute mark. We'll stop there and pick up with looking at the tribal peoples in 1492, where they were and who they were, and we'll look at some of, in detail, Mesoamerica.